And so we are once again looking at Romans, and I lined up a few of the themes for us to look at within the context of the Thanksgiving, the prayer and Thanksgiving. And here, however, before we launch into that, is a brief outline, another outline, just to remind us where we are. And verses 1 through 15, the intro and prayer and thanksgiving, followed by a long section, verse 16 through 331. And as I have outlined it there, the idea that all have sinned but are justified by grace. Chapter 4 is kind of a pivot. It's about Abraham and whether or not in Abraham how he is exemplary through his faith and by the fact that he is the Gentile before the Jew had ever been thought of. He doesn't receive circumcision until after God accounts him righteous. So that's chapter 4, 5 through 8. We have a mix of household images to substantiate Paul's claim that Jews and Gentiles are both welcome within the community of faith. And these household images are supported by Paul's continuing argument about the cross, about the resurrection of Christ, about the atonement, and all of those factors. So it's a really heavy load. That's a load-bearing part of Paul's letter. In 9 through 11, the part of the result of Paul's argument is that Jews and Gentiles will look at one another and say, well, what is our relationship? And so the relationship Paul describes is sibling rivalry, where the Jews will look at the Gentiles as interlopers, as those who are not worthy, and this creates this sibling rivalry. So Paul's going to try to explain that. I think this might be the emotional center of Paul's letter. In chapters 12 through 15, Paul identifies practical aspects to the message. Practical aspects including ways of living, ways of being. Included in this, the relationship to governing authorities in chapter 13, a very controversial chapter by and large, but a significant one. Chapters at the end of 13 into 14, you have Paul's description of how the weak and the strong in the faith are to live side by side in the context of the love that Paul describes in chapter 12. And then chapter 15, dealing with more practical aspects of his ongoing mission and message. And 16, the conclusion with greetings. So one little word here that that you should bear in mind. Let me see if I can make an instant new slide, right? So Paul has differentiates letters divide into two sections. And the sections, and you'll pardon me by trying to get this right while I'm recording. Isn't that great? But here it is. Orthodoxy, and then orthopraxy. Orthodoxy is right thinking, right doctrine, and orthopraxy is right living, right behavior. Paul's letters will divide this way. So, for instance, in our letter here, in Paul's letter to the Romans, I would suggest to you that chapters 1 through 11 function as the orthodoxy part. Here's how you believe. Here are the things you got to get your mind right. And so, and then the orthopraxy section begins in chapters 12 and extends through 15. If you remember back to Galatians 1 through 4 and even parts of 5 provide the orthodoxy section, like thinking about how the faith works, the essential elements of the gospel, that there is no other gospel, the teaching about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, the covenant, the promise, all that stuff, all that teaching stuff happens. And then from that, you get the notion of what it means to live in the context of that new thinking. So Paul's letters, the only letter I can see that there are a couple of letters that defy this kind of organizational plan, even though the plan is embedded within it, and those are 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which Paul has a very different feel for. But by and large, Paul will deal with these elements, and he will deal with them from the point of like dividing his text like that. So orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So once again, we go back and we are going to look at this beginning section, this section, and we want to begin with restating the thesis statement of 1:16 through 17. And that thesis statement, which you can find right here, begins this powerful section. We talked it a little bit, so we're going to talk it some more. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, that is the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, that is, through and through faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. Now, you can see there's a little note here, and if I put my cursor over there, the one who is righteous through faith will live. This is a quote that will come up again in chapter 4, whose impact is felt throughout this first section. That is that living a life of faith or trust in God grants to one the reckoning of God's righteousness, which presupposes that God is righteous to be able to give such a verdict. So in the gospel, God's justice is revealed completely by faith, and Paul substantiates this by quoting at least 2 places in the Old Testament, Genesis 15 and Habakkuk 2. You can look those verses up. Habakkuk 2:9, I believe, is the one, and Genesis 15, which Paul will allude to in Romans 4, discussing Abraham's trust in God. As we said, in my view, the rest of the Bible is a comment on Genesis 3. What will God, and it's usually read this way, what should I do to dig myself out of this hole that sin and rebellion have created for me, this broken relationship with God? What shall I do? And I keep pushing for an alternative reading to that, which is, what will God do? What will God do to address the failure on the part of humanity in Genesis 3? This is a question of God's rightness, of God's justice. If God has created a world that is untenable, that is unlivable, then what kind of a God would then thereby be able to judge harshly those who can't live according to that standard? Doesn't that make God some kind of a despotic ruler, capricious and malevolent? And so the rest of the Bible has to do with what will God do. And if you're a Gentile and you're reading this, you have a lot of gods to choose from, including some very powerful deities. Deities were known by their benefactions. That is, what has this god or goddess done to bless me and my family? And what we will discover, I think, in Romans is that Paul is trying to paint a picture, an accurate picture, I might add, of God's justice in the face of the countervailing claims of Roman imperial theology. That is, the Roman Empire provided you through its spirit of Augustus, that the Roman Empire is providing you some sort of a deity to trust that is just. You will remember that the Romans for sure love their law. That is true. And since the time of Augustus's reign, all the way until 14 AD, the Romans had prided themselves on a religious revival too. So this is about worship, and it's about worshiping the right God in the right context. And so that's that, we should kind of bear that in mind. Which leads us to this first major section. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to invite you to read the section through, chapter 1, 18 through 36. You can pause the video and go ahead and read that section. All right, so if you've read the section, I'd like to walk you through it. This is a pretty difficult section to get through, especially trying to communicate through a video like this, but we're going to take our best shot. If you look at the thesis statement here, in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, that is, in the gospel. But the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. Now, this is both apocalyptic as well as bearing along the lines of God's justice. That the wrath of God is revealed, and that's a present tense, so that is a continuing revelation, and we will see what kind of revelation that looks like, what kind of revealing, against all ungodliness and wickedness, by those who, by their wickedness, suppress the truth. So Paul draws a connection between morality on the one hand and truth on the other, so that character contributes to truth-telling. Character will keep you free from illusion. That's an important distinction to frame. However, what I'd like to say about verses 18 through 36 is that Paul bears to his readers standard vice lists that were well known, and a caricature of Gentiles that had been very well known to Jews of the time, and probably well known to Gentiles who had participated in synagogue worship. So let's look at this sin list. So God's nature is clear, Paul says, so we're without excuse. And even though they knew God, they did not honor. So look at what happens in verse 21. See, this is about worship. So faith is the first launching pad, that this faithful trust in God is the launching pad. And how does humanity go askew? By not giving thanks and by not honoring, it makes their thinking futile. So connect this with the previous header, and that is, by their wickedness suppress the truth. So they did not honor God, and then they became futile in their thinking. Their senseless minds were darkened. I don't believe Paul is trying to explain some kind of a natural theology here, where you can unpack all of God's nature by studying the natural world around you. What I am suggesting is that the natural world around us take on greater clarity with the light of God's grace as an addendum. No one can come up with the cross. That's a revelation you can't come up with on your own. At the same time, once you have the cross, you can see things in greater clarity. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, he once said, I believe in the sun because I can see it in the sky, but I believe in the sun because I can see everything else in its light. That's kind of the way it works in this section. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling immortal humans. This is about worship, idolatry, the exchange of the ultimate for what's not ultimate. And what is the verdict? So after idolatry, and therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity. Now this next section, when Paul begins to talk about the exchange, and here the term worship comes into play, and rather than worship the Creator, they serve and worship the creature. And I'm going to have to take a break and come back to this section in the next video.